Greetings everyone and welcome to another exciting episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode we're continuing on with our VCA 6 series. Joining us back for a little more of that action is our good friend Mr. Ronnie Wong. Ronnie, welcome back to the show, sir. How's it going?
Well, it's going very well as we continue on in our VCA 6 series. Today we're going to take a look at, well, availability options and features that we have, of course, inside of vSphere. And the good thing is, by this point, you're an expert at most of I say an expert, you at least know the majority of what we're going to talk about. But there are a few more technologies that we need to take a look at as well. And so that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that you actually understand that there's a breadth of technology that is out there to help with the idea of availability, right? Now, when we talk about the availability, right, for most of us at the end user level, it's that particular service, machine that we want, whatever it is absolutely going to be there. It's going to do what we want, when we want it, at any time that we want it, and that's kind of the key. And normally at the network level, right, we talk about high availability more than anything else, fault tolerance more than anything else. And so when we start thinking about those two, right, we've already discussed a lot of that technology and talked about the way that they do work in a very basic way. And we've actually shown even inside of the vSphere console where you can actually go and turn those things on. We're going to take a look at that a little bit later on as well. But overall, though, when we start taking a look then at the idea of high availability, this has to not only include that technology like that, okay, but there also, of course, which is one of the big things inside of data centers, is how do we do backups, okay? And so when it comes down to it, the availability feature that we're talking about that really ensures that we have availability regardless, no matter what, is that ability for us to do backups. Now, when we start taking a look then at the idea of backing up a computer, well, we've got a couple of different things that we could absolutely do here. One, we could actually run a backup of the entire VM host, right, the ESX host, back up everything on it, and that actually will work to back up that ESX host. But most of the time in today's environment, though, that's kind of an unusual and maybe even almost a pointless backup. And because there's not a lot of configuration we tend to do on the host itself, okay? Now, don't get me wrong, but you might say, well, what if I have virtual machines stored? Yes, that'll back it up. That's one of the ways to do it. But even in today's data center environments, usually we're actually kind of offloading the storage of even those VMs, right, off to some other data store that may be like a SAN appliance or something else that we might have available. So a lot of times just backing up that host is really not what we need. What we really need to do is we need to focus in on the technology, right, that we really need to back up. And when that comes down to it, we are now starting to talk about the idea here of the way that we tend to back up, well, VMs more than anything. Now, we do a lot of backups around here because we don't like to lose data. But backing up a VM actually is fairly simple in the grand scheme of things, right? But it can be time intensive, and it can actually be a little bit challenging because of where these VMs actually reside and the way that we name these things. So you do want to pay attention to that when we start talking about it too. So the manual way to do a backup of a VM, I think, is kind of the easiest thing. If I can get access to that data store, I simply right-click, I copy it, I put a little drive on it, move the whole thing over, there is my backup. And will that work? You better believe it. That will work just fine. But now, when we start talking about data centers like the size that Daniel worked in, right? Me, I'm kind of a, you know, the kind of very small data center, right? 5 or 6 servers max is what I'm used to dealing with. Daniel, how many servers do you think over there at the insurance company you worked at?
We had, in our data center, we probably had a little over 100.
Oh, just a little over 100.
Yeah.
So a little bit more in scale and size. And to actually back up all those VMs, which might have actually included, I'm going to say, a couple of hundred, maybe 3, 4, maybe 1,000 VMs that you might actually be running there. Well, now all of a sudden it's like, yeah, right-clicking and copying 1,000 VMs along with those files, maybe a little bit more than intensive. So the good thing is, since vSphere has offered us so many different solutions, another solution that VMware offers us is something that they of course call vSphere Data Protection. Okay, vSphere Data Protection. Now this is one that you can, I think, yeah, at least in the Enterprise Plus editions, you have access to it. In the standard one, not so much so. But in this one, right, when you start taking a look, it is about the idea of now, across my data center, okay, now I need to actually back up those things so that even in the loss of the entire data center, what happens is we have a backup of it, even if that happens. So that's what the vSphere data center does for, or data protection does for us, is to be able to actually say, hey, here's how we're going to do this. Now, this particular type of protection, though, works in conjunction with, of course, what is called the vSphere replication. Okay? Along with this technology, it also works together with the high availability, and the fault tolerance. So all of it kind of comes together underneath the idea of data protection at the same time. But for you and me, if we're just introducing, we can think of this more of our backup management system. When do we do backups? How do we do them? And what's actually going to be effective? And where is this actually going to go? And how is this stuff going to happen? Okay. So what does the data protection really do for us? Well, at the beginning, let's just take one VM because, again, with numbers, I think on the low numbers I can handle. Okay, once you start getting above, the 2 digits, I'm probably not so good at.
More than what's on the end of these
Yeah,
sticks.
more than what's on the end of these, and all of a sudden now we're actually getting challenged. At least I am. So let's just take one. Okay, so how does it do it? Well, the way that the data protection works here is that it says, look, what we're going to do first is simple. We're going to make a local copy first. Okay, and you might say, that's insane. Why would you ever back up something to the local copy, to the local drive? Well, they make a local copy first, but that's where then that vSphere replication comes in, right? And then they essentially say, all right, now that we have that local copy, it can now be relocated to our DR, our disaster recovery, which is hopefully off-site somewhere, okay? So that is the key, is that it actually makes it first, and then it replicates it over there. So this gives us that protection here that we know that we're going to have that ability to do so. And the good thing is, with data protection, we can turn it on, and make sure that everything's actually going to do what we need to. Now, the other thing about it, of course, is that, it's one of the things that the hard concepts, especially if you're new to IT, that the term backup is actually only half of the job, right? If you make a backup, perfectly fine, but I know people that have made backups and say, oh yeah, I have a backup, and you go and restore it, and it says, oh, look, file corruptor not found. Backup does not exist. Or file type is incompatible, whatever it is.
I think it's at that point when the beads of sweat start forming and the panic sets in. I've definitely seen that happen. And this is why normally in a typical data center environment, we're backing up in multiple different ways. I'm backing up using tape backup. I've got a disaster recovery site. I'm replicating across a WAN link to a different state. You're doing everything you can to make sure that you have as much data backed up in as many ways as possible just to give us that fault tolerance.
And so if you remember the simple procedure that I just said and what Daniel just said, right? As many ways as possible. The default way automatically leaves you with 2 backup copies, right? The one that's local, which is the one you're not going to depend on, but then the replication over to the backup to the disaster recovery site. So in other words, you have 2 backups actually existing just in the default way that the data protection works. Now, does that mean you will all, no, most of us know, you don't back up to the same exact hard drive that you took the backup of, but at the same time, it at least gives you that ability, right?
Now, Ronnie, they do that. They make that local backup basically for speed, right? They just trying to give you high availability, really quickly access, but we don't rely on that, right?
Correct. Yeah, you just want it for speed because when it's doing backup, right, it does have to kind of slow down and do a little bit of a backup. But imagine that they said, look, we're going to turn this backup on, and here it is, Ronnie, you're in Gainesville. Our backup, our disaster recovery is over in Vancouver, which is on the other side, on the west coast of another country. Well, now all of a sudden, if that's my only backup my backup, well, that's a little bit long distance. And in between here and there, think about how many places that's possible along that way. Maybe just even at my gateway, but let's say just anywhere along there that traffic could slow down, could cause drops, could cause, you name it, before it actually arrives over there, the latency, there's just a ton of time. But by making that local copy, it really does speed things up. And then it says, all right, now the local copy's made, let me just replicate this over there. And then in the end, hopefully you'll have 2 identical copies of that machine and you're ready to go. Yes, you don't depend on it, but at least you know that even during that time, in the middle of the transfer, right? Transfer doesn't happen, you still have what? You still have a backup, okay? And when now it actually needs to replicate again, it will actually start doing it again, and when it needs to.
Yeah, then you can lean on it heavily. I mean, we're not saying you don't use your local backup. We're saying that if the worst has happened, you've got that local copy, right? But if the hard drive on that local copy dies, now what do you do? So that's why they make a local one. They have a local one that's nice and fast. I can access it as long as I have drive access, and I can recreate my VM or whatever has gone bad. But if the worst happens, that drive fails, that backup is now gone. That's why we say you don't rely on it, because now we got to reach out to our one in Vancouver or wherever we've stuck it in Iceland. Put it on ice, right? Even though it's quite green there, I understand.
Yeah, it is beautiful from what I understand as well. So it's just one of those neat things that you think that the default way really did automatically leave you with a backup, and then it replicates the backup. So they've thought about that idea the same way that Daniel's actually mentioned it too. Now, the other thing about it is, remember that that's part of, like I said, a backup, especially when people entering IT, they think, oh, this is the greatest thing in the world. And it is. Okay? It absolutely will ensure that your data is actually there. But the other part of it is that making sure that you can restore it too. Okay? Now, in this restoration part, this is where you always have to test and verify. So the good thing is, it doesn't have to be restored back to the actual source server again. Okay? So it allows you to actually go ahead and take your replicated one, and actually you can go ahead and do a restoration to a target, another complete other server, or you can actually replicate it back to the original source. Normally we replicate back to the original source if we need to, but a lot of times if we're actually just testing it out, we may do that randomly and go, oh, let me just replicate over here, verify that it's on, and then we'll kind of turn the thing off and not worry about it. But that's some of the things that really kind of helps out to do that. The other thing, of course, is because we also have the VMware tools, and you should, of course, have that installed on every VM that you actually do create inside of VMware, it also checks those heartbeats to verify, okay, that, hey, that machine's actually working and doing everything that it needs to. But this is a quick way that it actually makes a check of the replication and everything else that goes on. And when you turn it on, it actually knows, hey, that this is a backup copy and everything. So you got to realize that that's also a part of it too. And then because of that duplicated backup, the very fact that it actually makes the backup first and then just replicates it, you minimize network traffic more than anything else by doing this. So it really does. Whoever it is and all those guys at VMware, you got to love them, because they try to think of everything that affects what could happen in your data center, to try and minimize the impact and still give you all the availability and features that you want. But this is what actually makes that server administrator's heart kind of glow a little bit, because they're like, wow, this is a fairly decent backup system that they have. And the nice thing is, it's actually done along with that replication in the background, that vSphere replication, so that you don't have to worry too much. Now, I'm not going to say you shouldn't check them. You should. Should you restore them and verify? You better believe it. But they've got it figured out. It's not something that you had to come up with a whole new process to go, man, this is great and it's working, but we've always got to think about that idea of disaster recovery, which you always do. They're thinking about it for you. So it makes it very neat, very easy.
That's right. Now, don't think that the guys over at VMware have just stopped there. They are a smart group of people. To be honest with you, I'm pretty impressed with them. They have said, you know what, well, we want to make sure that you have the ability to really diversify your disaster recovery strategies, right? We don't want you to just be able to lean or just have to lean on using backups. Not that that's not a good solution. It is. It's a fantastic one, and that's why most people do that. But they've really gone above and beyond, went the extra mile, and given us some extra features that we can lean on for disaster recovery. Right, Ronnie?
They really have. The idea of the traditional disaster recovery site is pretty expensive, right? When you actually go from, you talk about the terms cold side and hot side and stuff like that, it can actually range from, I'm going to say, relatively inexpensive. I'm not going to say cheap, because that's the wrong term, to really a parity, right, which is the most expensive way that we can do everything. But VMware says, look, we can actually implement something in this way, which is actually do kind of a replication and a backup to the cloud instead. And so what they actually do is that they have what they call vSphere VMware vCloud Air. I'm going to not say everything. Disaster recovery. So vCloud Air disaster recovery allows me to actually have my disaster recovery as a cloud-based solution. Okay. Now, most of us might go, oh, I don't know if I actually really trust that or not, but it's really something that you can actually do. And what this does is kind of strange here, is that it really does. It virtualizes your entire infrastructure and essentially backs that up to the cloud. Okay. And it does it through that vSphere replication. at the hypervisor level, so it actually brings everything over that it can to do that. Now, could that be expensive? You better believe it. It's probably very expensive, but it's a solution that may absolutely be something that you're willing to spend a little bit of time in, okay? Now, what about for those of us that go, no way, that's not anywhere in the ballpark that we want? Well, of course, you can still do your own private cloud type of disaster recovery as well. And this is where we do count on those virtualized technologies like the virtual SAN technology that we've talked about, as well as vSphere replication. And when we start doing stuff, right, and we start creating the SANs and we start actually backing up those machines like that, works incredibly well, okay? It works seamlessly, especially also works dynamically if you also implement another solution that is called the VMware Site Recovery Manager, okay? The VMware Site Recovery Manager is exactly like it sounds. It's a software solution for disaster recovery. It automates the execution or executing a disaster recovery plan, okay? Now, what in the world is that about, okay? Well, remember, disaster recovery planning, drills, you know, being on call, being the guy that's actually going to be there when these drills happen, it takes a lot of time, okay? And even just to get implemented and started here, well, they're saying, look, they have something that can actually automate that idea of executing the disaster recovery plan in a virtualized environment, okay? So if you actually implement all this even in your private cloud solution, there's a way to automate the kickoff of this if something does happen to your actual primary site. So you can't beat that they've even thought about the fact that, look, it could be that when you call Ronnie at 2 o'clock in the morning, he's not as responsive as he needs to be. And we can actually set those limits, set policies to make it kick off the way that we want to.
Wow, that's actually really cool, because that is one of the most difficult things when a disaster happens, is to coordinate all the efforts, make sure that everybody gets up and gets moving and starts recovery, because as soon as you can get ahead of that problem, the better, because you don't want to lose business continuity, right? We're all about, we're here talking about high availability. As long as my site is down, as long as my business is down technologically, I'm not making money, I'm not profiting. My customers, I'm losing them. So having another step already taken care of for you, right? That's one less thing you have to worry about. And again, VMware, they really have looked at this from the 10,000 foot view and said, we gotta encompass every possible scenario that we can, put it in software, let the software take care. You said, boss just said, if we've got computers, shouldn't they be automating things for us? Why are we doing all this work? And we've got all this horsepower, let's use it. VMware, that's exactly what they're doing.
It really is amazing that all of this can actually be done in the ways that we've talked about, okay? Because manually having to set up any of this stuff, right? Setting up backups for every single server, not something I want to do, I guarantee, okay? Heck, every single VM, definitely not something I want to do as well. But being able to implement this in software and saying, yes, this is how we want our VMs to back up and how we want it to do. We target wherever we want those things to go, and we are off and we are ready to go. Great management solution for us. That VMware replication is kind of the key element here too, okay? Now, I do want to mention this idea of this VMware replication, because this is a little bit strange in the way that this one works as well, okay? So we've talked briefly about that vCenter, and I mean just briefly about the vCenter. Essentially, it is what ties together like vSphere into the ESX host so we can control everything that we need to do. And actually, it is kind of the management interface for everything that we do inside of vSphere, okay? Now, the way that works, though, is it's not magic. That's what I want to say, okay? It's not magic. The strange thing is, it actually comes in the form of a virtual appliance, okay? vSphere does. So, in other words, it's a VM, okay? It's a VM that you actually load up inside your ESX host, and that's where it actually begins, is that load up of that, and then you can run vSphere on top of everything, and it actually loads up as well. vSphere replication is the same thing. It's another appliance. So this one costs extra money for you to actually be able to use, but it's actually a part of it that you can actually bring in, and it's another appliance that you have. So as long as your host machines can run VMs, you're perfectly fine. Now they do have a couple of different requirements, though, and I want to make sure that I put this out there, because if not, I'll end up forgetting. So even though they sell an appliance, remember when you go in and create a VM, you actually have to create it according to some specs here, okay? So one of the specs that they require on the VM or the replication here is that it's going to be a 64-bit appliance. It's going to be a dual-core CPU. So you got to make sure that you actually have at least a dual-core CPU configured there. You need at least a 10 GB hard drive, and then you have to create another 2 GB hard drive, and then you need 4 gigs of RAM. Okay, so it doesn't have to be much, but you have to at least create those things, and then you can load up that that open format, the OVF, I think is what it is, open virtual format appliance, or OVA, and all of a sudden now you have that replication thing go on, and it actually begins to work in the background. So it is a lot of neat technology that allows us management, though, at the virtual level, which means we again don't have to actually go into like the command line interface and you know, if you're in Windows, right, it's like PowerShell and configure all this stuff and get it working here. A nice VM is essentially the way that we can actually manage a lot of everything that we're seeing. It makes it very easy for us, great to actually be able to manage. So you do want to take a look at that, okay? The last thing that we want to talk about just briefly here, and this is something that's just called out on the objectives here, is to take a look at where we would configure high availability. Now, we briefly took a look at it in another episode, but let's do a reminder here, because it's always great to actually do a little bit of a repetitious reminder just briefly. So here it is. I'm on my vSphere server on my machine here, and this will kind of help us out. Okay, so let's see it from here. I clicked on the home screen at this particular point. And so you have a couple of different options that you can get there if you're talking about implementing high availability. So normally what I'm going to do is come down here in this details section and click on, let me see, let's do hosts and clusters, because that's the way I normally go. And then once we have a cluster, right, this is where we can actually implement a lot of the new technology. You don't have the cluster set up, it's not going to work. So verify that you have your cluster set up over here. If you don't see this cluster set up, and you only have one ESX host in your environment, yeah, high availability is probably not going to work for you the way that you want to. Okay, so once you have that particular one, there's the site A. I'm going to just let's see here. I'm going to right-click. No, I'm lying to you. I'm not going to right-click at all. I'm going to click on Manage. That's what I was looking for. I always look for Properties. I don't know
You're
why.
a Windows guy, right?
Yeah, I always look for Properties, but it's Manage and then Settings. And notice here in this kind of blue area, there it is, vSphere HA, which stands for vSphere High Availability, and it's currently turned off. So if I click on Edit, here are just some of the basic things that I have to decide if I'm actually going to do this. One, of course, is simply turning it on. Okay, so now that I've got it turned on, let me kind of zoom out just a little bit so I can verify that I'm not missing anything. Nope, nothing there. So then I can, well, maybe. There we go. Try to make sure we can see everything that we need to. Move that over just a tad bit. Host monitoring. If I need to make sure that I monitor on the heartbeats, we can do that. Verify that that is actually going to be part of the cluster that I can do high availability with. Same thing with the component monitoring here as well. So does that host have the capability to detect various failures that do not necessarily cause virtual machines to go down? Okay, and would deem it unusable, you can also add that in. And then, of course, you can even monitor and manage the individual VMs if you choose to. Now, just when you think that you're done, you, of course, can expand that out. Let me give it a moment. And this will also tell you, of course, the default conditions, okay, that you can actually see whether or not they're actually there. And then the restart priority, you can, of course, change that. And you can continue to go down through here and change those levels that you need to for the responses that you need, okay? So even though it seems as simple as just a checkbox, which is what I had said in a previous episode, there are a lot more features. Now, we're not going to take an entire episode and go through all those features, because that's when it gets into the configuration, but it doesn't mean that you can't, right? Remember what we've also said in a previous episode too, is that you can go and actually get access, essentially, to the same thing that I'm using right here on the show. And you just go into VMware and you actually say, hey, I want to do a virtual lab of vSphere, and you keep searching for it. You'll have to create a registered account, but once you do so, you'll be able to get access to it, and then you'll be able to launch this up. Take a look at some of those. one of the main things, and actually tell you the truth, and the entire exam, the only thing they call out a configuration for it, at least knowing where it's going to be, is this on high availability. So of all the things that they could actually call out, this is the only one that they say, hey, take a look at the configurations that you have available to you. Know how to turn it on is essentially what you actually need to be able to do. So we wanted to make sure that we also showed you that feature as well for our particular show today.
That's right.
So a lot of different things that we can do in terms of our availability features.
Yeah, and there's nothing better than some good hands-on to really solidify the concepts and the practices that we've been talking about throughout these different episodes. So definitely avail yourself of them having that free trial. And plus, it's kind of fun, right?
It is.
It's like you don't have to worry about bringing down an enterprise-level solution. You can just play and turn things off, turn things on, break it all you want, and then reset it back to 0 and play again.
And speaking of that, right, this is a fully featured solution just about, and they have some on other products, and we'll see that in another episode again. But here, I mean, to sit there and go, look, you mean I have access to a virtualized cluster that I can actually do this? And yes, okay. We can actually turn on, turn off stuff. Yes, you can actually do all that without you even having to build your own virtual environment or having to download software and install it and take hours sometimes to try and just configure it just right here. They've got it done for you. I would take advantage of it when getting ready for this exam.
Yeah, that's the way to fly, right?
It is.
All right, Ronnie, thanks for dropping by and explaining these concepts for us today. We thank you guys for joining us. We're going to go ahead and sign off. For IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We'll see you next time.